Barnabas Theological Seminary's Chapel Podcast.
The person who really has coordinated these and gotten these speakers together is our speaker today, Manny Brewer. And I've known Manny for many, many years of missionary life and activity on my own part, and I regard him as like the dean of pastors of mission in local churches in America. And he served in three very, very significant churches as the full-time director of mission outreach of those churches. And that's part of the reason why we've got this theme this year, is to demonstrate to you that it's not only those who have a visa and a passport in their pocket and they're going overseas that advance the cause of Christ worldwide. It's also the local church, Christ indwelling every one of us, and those who organize and administrate that activity from local churches. It's not a boring subject, it's a full-time job. You could have this job possibly in the future. So let me just give you a few words about Manny Brewer, since you don't all necessarily know him as well as I do. But Manny Brewer serves now as the Training and Partnership Facilitator for East-West Ministries. He works on the International and Pastor Support Program Trainer for Voice of the Martyrs, and he's known to us as Manny. He's been blessed to teach, train pastors in 130 countries in the world. He's also an ordained minister, and for 36 years, he's experienced missions pastoring in local churches. Manny is currently teaching as an adjunct professor right here. He teaches pastoral ministry from a missional perspective, and has really brought a tremendous amount of value to what we're trying to do here at DTS. He's also served as an adjunct at Denver Seminary, where Mark Young is now president and who will be our speaker at our WEC conference in the spring. I think you'd be rejoiced to know that. Also at Trinity International University and other schools. He holds a Doctor of Missiology from Biola University. So join me in welcoming Dr. Manny Brewer.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's really great to be here with you this morning. I sat where you sat, not necessarily here. I went to Talbot Seminary, but more than 40 years ago, I was in lots of chapel services just like you, and wondering what was the special plan that God had for me. And I wish I knew then what I know now as I look back over these last years, is that I was more concerned about what was the special plan God had for me, and yet for many of you who've taken the Perspectives course or other courses like that, you know that what God is doing is He's given us a great plan from Genesis to Revelation, and He wants us to know about His plan, and it's not about what's the special plan that He has for us, but it's God's plan and how we can fit in with His overall plan, and what's the unique contribution that we can make to the furtherance of His kingdom. When my wife and I were getting ready to get married, we felt that what we should do was go somewhere for a time and see if this is what the Lord wanted us to be doing, working in missions for the rest of our life. And so we took an extended honeymoon. We went for 5 months from May to September in 1974 to Ethiopia. We went to the northern province of Eritrea. Only thing is, we took a team of 8 with us. And just before we were to leave, we were told, and Steve, we were with SIM, we were told that 2 of the missionaries had been kidnapped. One was then killed, one was being held hostage by the Eritrean Liberation Front, because where we were going, there was a civil war going on, and this particular province was wanting to break away. It was a 30-year civil war. Ultimately, they did break away and become their own independent country. So we were told we were not going to be now going to Asmara, the capital in the north. Instead, we were going to be going to the south. Our role was to go and come alongside a large church in the north, be an encouragement to them because of the hard times that were going to be coming in the future. We were in Rome. We were flying, we flew to Jeddah, and then, which is the port city of Mecca, and then we're flying straight south over the Red Sea, and we were going to be going to Addis Ababa. Instead, the plane made an unexpected stop in the very city we wanted to be in, even though we had been told that we were now not going to be going there. We landed in Asmara. All these soldiers with machine guns came on the plane, and they ordered the 8 young people from Southern California off the plane. They then began unloading all the luggage. This took almost an hour for them to unload everything. We went through, picked out all of our luggage. They reloaded everything on the plane. This is an Italian airliner, an international flight. The plane then took off and went on down to Addis Ababa and left us with the soldiers on the runway. And we did not know what was going on. We went into the airport, found the missionary that we were going to be working with, and he said, well, I just felt that what the Home Office was telling you to do was crazy. We got a big famine here. We got a civil war. There's international war going on with Somalia. We need you here. We don't need you in Addis Ababa. So I went to one of my friends that I've been discipling in the control tower, and I said, there's an international flight coming from Rome, and need to tell them we got to get 8 young people from Southern California off that plane. And that's how we got into Asmara. We never worked in Addis Ababa the whole time. And the Lord gave us those months of ministry there. That was part of the answer. We'd ask God, do something special to show us if this is what you want us to be doing for the rest of our lives. And that's what we prayed before we left. It's a long story, but my wife at that point was she was working for the FBI in Los Angeles. She was part of the Division of International Espionage, so we had to even leave. She had to leave the FBI to go on this mission. They even came to our wedding and to our send-off at the airport to encourage her not to go, but we still went. Felt that that's what the Lord wanted us to do. On the day that we left, Emperor Haile Selassie had been put under house arrest the night before. And for the next 17 years, the country was communist. Mengistu Haile Mariam was the dictator. He was responsible for maybe 2 million people's deaths. And it was a brutal regime, and many of our Christian friends suffered greatly. The pastor I worked with, Pastor Sahai, had electric shock treatments until he went insane. The girl that my wife was matched up with, Tibra, was raped. A lot of our friends were killed. Many of them fled to other places, to Kenya, to Sudan, to UAE, to Australia, Italy. Even some came to the United States. We even had some in our home to help them make the transition. But it was a terrible time for the church. And that was what the Lord used to introduce us at the very beginning of our ministry, to give us a heart for the suffering church. And that's why most all of what I've been doing over these last almost 40 years, we've been working in restricted access countries. I work with 5 large house church networks in China. I'll be leaving, Lord willing, Sunday on China to go back, and we're getting lots of missionaries now going to the Muslim world, and with the seminary that we're working with underground. But that's what the Lord did, is he began to give us a heart for the suffering church. And so I've come alongside, especially in these latter years, as a mentor to the persecuted church. I work with VOM and other groups and with East West, and it's a privilege to be serving in that capacity. When we came back, though, from Ethiopia, we told our church, we really feel now's the time for us to go out full-time as a missionary. My mentor at the time, I'm not just throwing names, but it was Dr. Ralph Winter. And I asked Ralph, now that I'm ready to go, what do you think I should do? And he says, now that you're ready to go, I think that you shouldn't go, and you ought to get 50 more people to go. And this is way before we were talking about mobilization and words like that. And so we came up with the title, Missionary at Large. There were no missions pastors in the U.S. at the time. And so I began functioning like that. Later on, we began calling ourselves missions pastors, but I originally was called a missionary at large. And I didn't do what Ralph said. Instead, we saw more than 200 people from our church go out as missionaries. So that was part of what we were doing, was traveling a lot, getting a lot of our people out, getting many others that were going in short-term ventures, and helping to mobilize an entire church where people saw that missions was not just for a few people, it wasn't just for a few missionaries, but yet there was things that the whole church could be doing as we shared that responsibility together. And so that's what I want to be talking about today, global ministry, opportunities for everybody. And it's basically just an old-fashioned Bible studies. We'll just take a few minutes and go through the book of Acts and look at lots of ways that it wasn't just the apostles, but hundreds and thousands of other people were from the churches. We're all coming alongside the apostles. We're all involved in ministry, and all were sharing in the load. When William Carey was getting ready to go to India, one of his pastor friends, Andrew Fuller, says, "You go to India and we'll stay behind and hold the ropes." Well, what we're finding as we look through all the pages of the book of Acts, we find that there were lots of people holding the ropes, helping, and it wasn't just something for a few people, there was something for everybody to do. And so that's what I want to be sharing with you today, and hopefully it's an encouragement to your heart as you think about maybe what the Lord is leading you to do. Think about God's great plan as we're going through these verses, and what's the best way that you can fit into His overall kingdom thrust as we live in these latter days. First thing we want to talk about as we look at all the different ways that the early church was involved is participation in times of distress. Participation in times of distress. And we're going to look at Acts chapter 15, first of all, in times of conflict and failure. In times of conflict and failure, Acts 15. Well-known passage. Paul and Barnabas are having a dispute over John Mark. And we know that it says Barnabas was desiring of John going along with them, verse 37, verse 38, but Paul kept insisting he's already deserted us once, we're not going to do it. It says that there was a sharp disagreement. Sometimes this word even is used for volcanic eruption. Some writers said it's even possible that there was a fist fight. They were that angry with each other. There was a violent disruption. And then it says that they separated from one another there in verse 39. This word only is used one other time in the New Testament, in Revelation 6:14, and it speaks of a cataclysmic ripping apart of the heavens. So this is a violent wrenching apart of two formerly best friends. And the Lord uses this to create two teams, not just one. People say, who was right here? They probably were both wrong if these words are any indication of what was going on. But what happens that the church comes alongside Paul. They give him Silas. He's committed by the brethren to the grace of the Lord and sent out. Barnabas also goes with John Mark. He goes back to his home island. Church tradition says that Barnabas dies on the island subsequently there in Cyprus. As a missions pastor, I had this happen many times. I had lots of missionaries who did not get along. I remember one time I had to fly to Bogota, Colombia 4 times over the course of a couple of years to try and patch up a big problem between some of the missionaries. I remember one time a family of 5 showing up at our doors and said, "We've been kicked off the field." What do you do if you're a pastor? You don't know they're coming and they just show up. And now we've got to begin trying to put the pieces back together. We even had one missionary who was kicked off the field, was so ashamed about it, so frustrated and angry about it, that he didn't tell us for 6 months. The organization didn't tell us for 6 months. And he was even back in our state. You say, how could that possibly be? It was because he was working in a restricted access country. We couldn't easily get in touch with him. And so you have... I think I've seen most everything over the years as a missions pastor with all the various challenges. We were in 3 churches in Los Angeles and Seattle and Minneapolis for 36 years as a missions pastor. What I would say, though, is that for you as a church to come alongside your missionaries, this is just a kind of a side note just for missionaries, come alongside your missionaries at these times of deepest distress, when there's been conflict and failure, some of the other things we're going to look at, and you minister to them there. At that point, you're going to be their friend for life. And this is the key times in their lives where you really need to be there. What about in times of loneliness? Acts 24:23. Times of loneliness. Paul is under house arrest. Felix, it says, having a more exact knowledge about the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will decide your case. Then in verse 23, and he gave orders to the centurion for him to be kept in custody, talking about Paul, and yet have some freedom and not prevent any of his friends from ministering to him. This is a very important time in the life of Paul. He's under house arrest there for 2 years. Luke is there for a good part of the time. This is probably the time when Luke is collecting all of his information as he's putting together the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, interviewing people as people come and minister to the Apostle Paul. So the Lord uses that time very significantly, not just in Paul's life, but even in the greater church. I've had missionaries in the past. I would fly into an airport. It'd be a 7 or 8 hour drive back into the jungle, and they would say, I'm just going to put this little micro tape recorder on because I want to talk, and I don't want to forget any of the things that we talk about, because they felt so lonely, so isolated. Even today with the internet, there are many missionaries who feel they can't trust people back in the home office. They don't understand what their situation is. And so loneliness for missionaries, even today, can still be an issue, even in big cities of the world. What about in times of loneliness? Acts 27, 2 and 3, times of sickness. The third point is in times of sickness, Acts 27. Paul is going on a ship to Rome, and they just have embarked. In verse 2, Aristarchus is with them, and Julius, it says in verse 1, is the centurion that's with Paul, and it says, and the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. 276 people on the ship. Julius, the centurion, allows Paul to go off the ship and go get some tender loving care from friends, from other believers. We don't know if he was seasick. We don't know if he came on the ship sick. We don't know if the ship was just going out for a day and was actually going to be stopping in this port, or if for some reason they're stopping just for Paul's sake. But for whatever reason, he's trusted enough, and he goes and Christians minister to Paul in his time of sickness. This is another crucial time. I've even gone with one of our workers to his chemotherapy sessions as he found out that he had cancer. He's there in another country, in another continent, and I'm going with him to the hospital as he's getting those chemotherapy sessions. We've had one of our missionaries have one of their daughters was severely burned, and the church Skyped them, sent a lot of money, sent people over immediately to go and be with them. It's really important that we be there during these times of illness and sickness, and when they don't really know what's going to be happening in the next even hours or days. That's important. But the whole church has that as a responsibility. What about participation in the work on the field? Participation in the work on the field. Younger career workers to assist in the work. Younger career workers to assist in the work. That's the next point. There, as Paul had this blow up with Barnabas as they go on to Derbe and Lystra. It says that Timothy joins him. Sometimes this could be a tremendous encouragement where the church can send a younger worker to come alongside and to help in the work. This is one of the best ways that a church can be an encouragement to those on the field. Look at Acts 19, assistants who ministered directly to Paul. Assistants who ministered directly to Paul. In Acts chapter 19, we find two of them mentioned. It says, and having sent into Macedonia two of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. Two people, Timothy and Erastus, were ministering directly to Paul. Now, how does this work in our situation today? We've had this happen with the churches that I've served at on numerous occasions. One of the missionary wives gets pregnant. She's then told that she needs to be in bed rest for the next 6 months. She's got other little kids. So what do? Well, you find a teenager in your church and you send her over there for the next 6 months or 8 months. And she's a nanny and she's helping the whole family and taking care of them. And she's ministering directly to them to allow them to be able to not only survive but to thrive even in a hard situation. There are going to be situations where you as a church can come alongside your missionary and minister directly to them, either on the field or in the home here back in the U.S. That's what happened with Timothy and Erastus. What about short-term workers? This is probably the only passages we're going to be looking outside of Acts. But in Colossians 1:7, it mentions Epaphras. And Epaphras has been sent by the church of Colossae to go and be with Paul while he's under house arrest during his first imprisonment in Rome. And so he's ministering to them, and even at the end of the time, he then is taking the letter to the church of Colossae back with him, and Paul is commending the church for having sent somebody like Epaphras to minister and serve with him. The same would be in Philippians chapter 2. And there, Paul is talking about Epaphroditus. This is a little different name, sounds similar, Epaphras. Now this is Epaphroditus. And Epaphroditus, there in verses 25 to 30, it says that I thought it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother, my fellow worker, my fellow soldier. He had been there working with Paul. He's now being sent back. He's taking the letter to the Philippian church back with him. It even says in verse 30, he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life, literally rolling the dice, risking his life to complete what was deficient in your service to me. You can't be there, and so he was there acting on your behalf, ministering to me and working in ministry with me, and this was Epaphroditus. This is a great encouragement for your missionaries when you could send short-termers. Sometimes we talk about short-termers meaning 1 week or 2 weeks. Oftentimes in the past we used the term short-termer to mean someone who went for 1 or 2 years. That's probably more like what Epaphras and Epaphroditus were doing. They were going for a longer length of time, and because they were there for a longer length of time, they could shoulder a lot of the burdens and really work alongside Paul in the ministry. All right, let's go to another passage. We're going to begin to look at our third area of participation in travel arrangements. Participation in travel arrangements. And it's pretty amazing. Paul went everywhere he did without travel agents, without the internet. Most of you are too young to even know what an aerogram is. And that's what we had to do 40 years ago when we were trying to set up trips. We had to write these real lightweight, light paper aerograms, mail them off, hope that they would get there. We've even documented it with some of the places we were working. Only about half of the aerograms ever got where they were supposed to go. And then the people at the other end, most of them did not have a phone in their own home. There weren't cell phones then. They had to go to a telephone company and make an appointment to receive a long distance call. And so there was all kinds of effort involved just to make just a trip. So that's why you didn't normally just go for a weekend or go for a week somewhere. You stayed for a longer length of time because it took so much time to get there. Well, how about helping to set up itineraries, and then writing letters of introduction. Helping to set up itineraries, you find that in Acts chapter 20. In Acts 20, verse 13, this is one of the we passages. So Luke is involved in this and says, "But we, going ahead to the ship, set sail for Assos, intending from there to take Paul on board, for thus we had arranged it, intending himself to go by land." You find many of these kinds of verses all through the book of Acts, as lots of people were making travel arrangements for Paul, and were all involved in the planning process. They also wrote letters of recommendation for Apollos. This would be in chapter 18, verse 27. Apollos is wanting to go to Achaia and speak. And so it says, "The brethren encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him." And so when he got there, he had letters of recommendation, and he was able to get into the churches and visit them and share and minister to them. We can Skype people now, we can send emails, and we can tweet, and we can do all the other kinds of things. All this is great. All this is needed, though, where you as a church, you as members of churches, you could come alongside your missionaries. Even when they're in other places around the world, you could connect them to people, send email addresses. All of us do that. You can even, when they're here in the States, you could help connect them to churches, other speaking opportunities, places where they can go and get involved. All of this was... it doesn't have to be a formal letter of invitation now, but that's the application is the same. What about assisting the apostles in travel with provisions? This is Acts chapter 15. Here we have the Greek word propempo. Therefore, being sent on their way by the church. So Paul and Barnabas are being sent on their way by the church in Antioch. And this is a technical term, not just to be sent, but it means to be sent on your way by providing provisions, by giving money, by having travel companions, by making arrangements. It's a fairly complicated word that could be used can be translated differently in different contexts. Point I'm making here, though, is that propempo does mean where all the people of the church were getting involved and networking with the missionaries and sending them out and being a part of their life and ministry. There's a new website. It just came on last week. It's operated by David Mead, and it's called propempo.com. So you could go to that. They're just in the early stages, but it's going to be for missions pastors and for lay leaders in churches of ways in which you can be networking together and serving each other around the world, propempo.com. What about assisting with travel companions, Acts 21. In Acts 21, we find that verse 15, "And after these days we got ready and started on our way up to Jerusalem, and some of the disciples from Caesarea also came with us." What's really interesting, I'm going to talk more about this passage in just a minute, but a lot of the Christians there at Caesarea did not agree with Paul going back to Jerusalem. In fact, they said through the Holy Spirit, "Don't go." And you would think, Paul says, "It doesn't matter, I'm going to go anyway." And they then say, "Well, the Lord's will be done," verse 14. Instead of just saying, "Well, if that's what you're going to do, fine, just go." Instead, they actually go with Paul and accompany him back to Jerusalem. And so many of them, even though they're in disagreement with him going, they still are going to help protect him and to show him that they love him, even though they disagreed. This is what happens, showing protection in the midst of travel. It's safer today than it is in Paul's day to be traveling, but it still is really good that you as a church think about ways in which you can be traveling with your missionary, offering the same kind of spiritual and physical protection that's needed. I was just in one situation earlier this year because I work with VOM and we were working with persecuted pastors. We were flying into Mali and we're there in the midst of a coup. We're landing there as a coup has started. And even as we're landing, we still don't know whether we're going to be staying in the capital that night or trying to get to the other side of the country and going in the middle of the night to get there. Staying in the capital would have been risky because that's where all the soldiers were as they're looking for the president. To drive across the country in the middle of the night when they could easily barricade roads and they could try and steal your vehicle or kill you, that could be risky as well. And so it was really good that I had two other African brothers that I was with where we could make a decision and decide what we needed to do. As it turned out, we ended up driving through the night for 6 hours. And the Lord protected us. But even today, some of your workers are still going to be working in tough places where there are some danger and where it is going to be helpful to have others with them to help protect them and to give them the kind of spiritual and moral support that's needed. Meeting needs upon arrival is the last one that we'll look at in this category. Meeting needs upon arrival. Paul has had this harrowing journey. He gets to Rome, and there it says that people have come from everywhere, and they're there to meet him and to welcome him and to meet his needs. Verse 15. This may sound a little bit corny, but sometimes it's still really good. It's still really encouraging to missionaries to have a whole bunch of people there at the airport to greet somebody when they come and to let them know how much they've been missed and to give them to love on them. That still is really a fantastic thing that you can do for your workers, and it doesn't take a lot of effort. Anybody could do that. What about participation during home visits? A fourth area would be participation during home visits. And let's talk about listening ears during furlough. Listening ears during furlough times. This is what we find in chapter 14. We'll just look at that chapter. But in chapter 14, as Paul and Barnabas are coming back from their first missionary journey, it says in the imperfect tense that we spent a long time with the disciples, and they were staying there and speaking and encouraging and telling them about the door of faith that God had opened to the Gentiles. And this was not just 5 minutes on a Sunday morning. It was where they were able to spend a long time with the disciples there in Antioch, and in many different contexts report all that God had been doing. They had a lot to share, and a lot of your missionaries have lots to share, and they need to be able to have listening ears, people who are willing to spend the time and to hear. Sometimes when a missionary family would come home, most of the time I did this, I would debrief with them. And sometimes it might even mean a couple days where all I do is just listen to them talk as they share what's gone on, go over a lot of the successes, many of the failures, frustrations. They don't have too many people who can do that. What about working shoulder to shoulder with the people? This would be in Acts 15. This is an encouragement to the missionaries as well. There in Acts, the Jerusalem Council has just occurred. They've sent a letter back. They've sent Judas and Silas to Antioch as well. And then it says that for these next many days, Paul and Barnabas stayed in Antioch, and they kept teaching, verse 35, and preaching with many others also the word of the Lord. That's an encouragement to missionaries where they can come back to their home churches and they can spend time and they can be involved in ministry. It may even require that you have an apartment for them or a house next to the church that missionaries can stay in. But for them to be able to feel included and to stay there and work alongside and teach with other leaders in the church and be involved in ministry, all that's a tremendous encouragement to our missionaries. What about offering homes for hospitality? We find that with Lydia. I won't go through the passages there in chapter 16. We see that with Priscilla and Aquila in chapter 18. But this is a great way that by people in your church opening up your homes and showing hospitality to our indigenous brethren who come from other countries, and even some of the missionaries from our own churches, and being in our homes. Or one time my kids, without me knowing it, took some time and counted up how many countries people had come from who had stayed in our home over the years, and they counted 80 countries. And sometimes even our kids would get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and here's a stranger walking down the hall. You know, they're terrified to begin with. They don't even know who it is because they've come in even after the kids have already gone to bed. But to have our kids sitting around the table and hearing from many of these people from Iran and from so many other countries around the world, and hearing their stories and what God has done, it was an incredible blessing for us. And so being hospitable and sharing is a blessing to other people, but it could be a great blessing to you and to your families as well. The last category quickly that we'll look at would be participation through exhortation. Participation in the ministry through exhortation. As we said there in Acts chapter 21, sometimes missionaries need a rebuke and correction. So rebuke and correction are needed. And that is what happened. They came alongside Paul and even said that the believers said, through the Spirit, don't go to Jerusalem. And yet Paul says, I'm going to go anyway. And they could not dissuade him from doing that. Not sure whether we can say that Paul was right or wrong at this point. All that we know is that he did not take the advice that was spoken through the Spirit for them to not go to Jerusalem, and he did. Just as a little side note, what this does say is that Paul was willing to go places and risk his life to take the gospel where it had never been shared before. So he gets stoned in some place like he goes to Derbe and Lystra and faces stoning and other persecution. But he was also willing to risk his life and even die to take an offering to the poor back to Jerusalem. And so not only was he willing to die to go plant the church in places where they had never heard the gospel before, but he's even willing to go serve the Christians, the poor Christians in Jerusalem, by taking money back to them. So we see that Paul did not make distinctions in his ministry. He was holistic in all the different needs that people had, and was willing to risk his life in every case. We had a situation like this with one of our missionary families. They were very productive. They had problems with one of their children who was now back in the U.S. We said, they're still your child, and even though we were not their home church, their mission agency didn't feel it was a problem. We still felt that that's what they needed to do. We even set aside the money for them to come home and make that commitment to be working with this one child for many years. This is one that was in and out of jail and lots of problems, drugs, mafia, lots of things I can't go into. But 7 years later, on a Skid Row radio program, as he's now come through, and he's married one elder's daughter, and he's holding down a job, and he's living a very productive life. He's saying, I want to thank those who allowed my parents to come back and parent me, because they were not able to give me the time while I was growing up on the mission field, and that's what made the difference that turned my life around. Sometimes the church has to step in and make some hard decisions. One couple, with 2 kids, we had 3 of the 4 of them were in really deep trouble, and we asked them to come home. Instead of just terminating their support, we worked with them, and for the next 3 years they stayed home, and the Lord healed them, and the Lord sent them back to the field. And for the next 30 years afterwards, that's what they did, is they ministered to broken missionaries all over the world, sharing out of their experience what the Lord had done through them, and giving them freedom in Christ, and helping put their lives back together. So you never know, as you give that kind of exhortation to strong-minded, independent-thinking missionaries who sometimes have a hard time getting along with each other. Sometimes they need to hear the truth, and sometimes you need to give them rebuke and talk straight to them, and maybe even follow it up with some action. But that is what sometimes they may need. What about encouragement through outward demonstrations of affection? In Acts chapter 15, the early church, in Acts chapter 20, the leaders of the Ephesian church have met in Miletus. They're sharing with Paul. Paul is then, they're all falling on him and weeping and embracing Paul and telling him how much they're going to miss him, because he said, "You're probably not going to see me again." We've had those kinds of situations, and missionaries need hugs. And I've even had those kind where we would hug and cry, and that is the last time that I see them. Some of them, my national friends who died representing Christ in their country. They need hugs, and they need outward signs of affection. What about through personal visits to the field, encouragement through personal visits to the field? We find that in Acts chapter 28, almost the very last verse of the book of Acts, where they're holding him under house arrest, but they're allowing people to come and visit him. And so people are coming and ministering to Paul and encouraging him. It's not encouraging if you just show up and don't tell them ahead of time that you're coming. Just happen to be in the area, and love to see Paris, love to come and visit you, and just walk in, tell them you're coming, and work it out ahead of time. But it could be a tremendous encouragement to the missionary. And then lastly, through letters and words of affirmation. We have so many possibilities now where you can email people, and you can use Skype and lots of other ways to send words of encouragement. I just would close with what it says in Proverbs 25:25, that like cold water to a weary soul, so is good news or from a distant land. This is how you can refresh people, and keeping in touch with them. And we have so many technological ways of now being able to do that, and encouraging and staying with them and letting them, working on issues that relate to them. Oftentimes, in Unreached People projects, as you're working with a missionary that's working in your partnership, churches are able to do this. All that to say, as we conclude, there are many places all through the book of Acts where you don't just see the apostles actively involved, but you see dozens and hundreds of other Christians, just the people in the pew, who are all coming alongside and being involved in ministry, because it's a global ministry and it takes everybody, and there's opportunities that everybody has to be able to serve the Lord. So I just hope that as you're spending these days at DTS, that the Lord will open it up to you in clearer ways, not only what His great plan is for, but also how you can best fit in to that great plan. Let's close in prayer. Lord, I thank you for my brothers and sisters who are here this morning. I thank you for this commitment that you've given to them to be studying and serving you during these crucial years of your life. I pray, Lord, that you would show them in very direct and even miraculous ways what's the unique contribution that they can make to the furtherance of your kingdom in the days to come. And then, Lord, give them the courage to step through that door and to take the steps that are necessary to be all that you want them to be. And we'll thank you for what you'll do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.